if we kind of think of what might have happened in this passage, Peter may have been thinking, because they weren't too far from the shore, maybe he was taking all his stuff with him. Like, I'm not gonna leave my cloak here. I'm gonna take everything, and he jumps in the water. Or maybe Peter was thinking that he would walk on the water. Maybe he got so excited that he was ready to walk on the water. And that's interesting. He casts himself. The word here that's translated into English, the word where he throws himself, he threw himself. I mean, not just dipped. I mean, he just threw himself into the water. So that's interesting. I kind of think, I think he thought he was going to walk on the water. I mean, once he realized it was Jesus, and the last time that happened, he walked on water, and maybe thinking this time, I'm going to walk. I'm not going to doubt. That's kind of interesting. Well, let's pick it up in verse 8. The other disciple came in the boat, dragging the net full of fish, for they were not far from the land, but about 100 yards off. When they got out on land, they saw a charcoal fire in place, with fish laid out on it and bread. Jesus said to them, "Bring some of the fish that you have just caught." So Simon Peter went aboard and hauled the net ashore, full of large fish, 153 of them. And although they were so many, the net was not torn. Let's pause here for a second on that. Let's take a look on that. I don't know if you noticed it like I did, but John says how many fish were in the net. He actually gives the number 153. Verse 11, there were large fish, 153 of them. Why did he say that number? When I saw that, it was like, what? Why? First of all, why even count them? Second of all, how does he know it's 153? Why would he remember that number? Well, the fact that John remembered the amount of fish really doesn't surprise me, because he's remembering this whole story and remembering enough to put in the Gospel of John. So his memory is pretty sharp. But to remember this number, why 153? Well, I've looked at many scholars and commentaries and things that people have ideas of what it could have been and really this is what I've come down to think. I think the reason that John mentioned 153 fish is, I don't know. I have no idea. I mean, I have no clue. And actually, that has nothing to do with the narrative. And so you could throw a guess up. I don't know. I just think it was really interesting. So we're going to pick it up. Why suggest something that doesn't change the narrative? So let's go with verse 12. Jesus said to them, "Come and have breakfast." Now, none of the disciples dared to ask him, "Who are you?" because they knew it was the Lord. So Jesus came and took the bread and gave it to them, and so with the fish. This was now the third time that Jesus was revealed to the disciples after he was raised from the dead. The third time. Pause there for a second. The third time. The third time. And again, they didn't recognize him at first. It's interesting. Jesus appeared the third time, and each one of those times, they didn't recognize him. Even though they saw him, and then he appeared, and they didn't recognize him again. And they didn't recognize him again. First with Mary didn't recognize him. Then the disciples in the room, they didn't recognize him. He had to show them his wounds. He had to prove it to them. Look, it's me. It's me, see? And now the third post-resurrection appearance, here in verse 14. They don't recognize him. So something about him wasn't like he was before. Let's pick it up in verse 15. So when they had finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" And he said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." And he said to him, "Feed my lambs." 1. Verse 16, he said to him a second time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" And he said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." He said to him, "Tend my sheep." 2. Verse 17, he said to them the third time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter was grieved because he said to him the third time, "Do you love me?" And he said to him, "Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you." And Jesus said to him, "Feed my sheep." 3. 3. After Peter denies Jesus 3 times, Jesus now receives 3 affirmations. Coincidence? Nah, not at all. 3 times. And what's interesting here is, why did he say feed my lambs? Why did he say tend my sheep? Why did he say feed my sheep? Remember what Jesus was doing with the 12. The 12 disciples, there's no coincidence that it was 12. Because there was 12 sons of Israel, the 12 tribes of Israel, who were to lead Israel. And they didn't do it. So Jesus is raising up 12 new leaders to lead the church. 12 new shepherds. And throughout the whole book of John, he pointed to the disciples, he pointed to the Judean leaders, the Judaeos, the Sanhedrin, as the bad shepherds. See, because they were the Jewish leaders, the Judean leaders were supposedly the ones that were to tend the sheep, Israel, but they weren't doing it. And Jesus even referred to them as bad shepherds. And then Jesus comes in, if you remember in John, and he says, "I am the good shepherd." And then he was raising up 12 new shepherds. So it's no coincidence he was saying to Peter, "Feed my lambs, tend my sheep, feed my sheep." Because Peter was going to shepherd New Israel, the New Israel. So let's pick it up in verse 18. "Truly, truly, I say to you, when you were young, you used to dress yourself and walk wherever you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and another will dress you and carry you where you do not want to go." This he said to show by what kind of death he was to glorify God. And after saying this, he said to them, "Follow me." Now it's pretty interesting. When you just read this, it doesn't make sense. Okay, so why is Jesus just inserting this whole thing about when you get old and how people are going to lead you, and you're not going to be able to dress yourself? What does it have to do with anything? But if you understand the background here, see in verse 19 in your translation, it may have a parentheses, and it may say, mine says, this he said to show by what kind of death he was to glorify God. That's not written. John didn't write that in the original. This was added to help guide, because really this passage really throws you off if you didn't know what he was talking about. See, what Jesus was talking about was how Peter was going to die. And then he says how Peter's death was going to glorify God. You see, the term stretch out your hands Now, we look at that as maybe stretch out your hand so people can put your clothes on, but no, that term was used by many early Christian writers in reference to the crucifixion. And stretch out your hands is what Jesus did. He stretched out his hand on the cross, and when they nailed it. That was a term that was used. Stretch out your hand was referring to crucifixion, and Peter knew that. We didn't, but they knew. Another term mentioned in this verse is, I will dress you. So, which is, it's odd. I will dress you. He says, in verse 18, he says, but when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and another will dress you and carry you where you do not want to go. Well, it kind of sounds like he's talking to Peter about when he gets old, and you're not going to be able to go where you want to go. People are going to take you. That's not what Jesus is talking about. He's talking about when Peter's life ends and how his death will glorify God. And he's mentioning this to Peter because that term there, I will dress you, another will dress you. So that word dress in the Greek word is zonio is the Greek word. Now that word means gird or bind. To dress, to gird, to bind. So when you look at this with crucifixion, let's put bind in there instead. And we know that stretch out your hand is referring to crucifixion. So if you read it again, you will stretch out your hands and another will bind you and carry you where you do not want to go. That's what happened to Jesus. Jesus is talking about that as what he did. And many crucified victims were fastened with ropes to the cross. And so binding him to the cross. Those who led him will not be friendly. Those who lead him will not be friendly because those who led Jesus were not friendly at all. But they forced him to go where he didn't want to go. And then Jesus says in verse 19, then follow me. Follow me. Which is interesting because later historical accounts say how Peter died. And as far as we know, there are accounts that say that Peter was crucified, but he was crucified upside down, that he refused to die the same way as the Lord did. But that's just uncertain. We don't know that for sure, but that's what some of the historical accounts say. So I thought that was interesting. That even in his death, Jesus was making a reference that Peter, you're gonna be a martyr like he did. And so really key there. So let's go on with verse 20. Peter turned and saw the disciple whom Jesus loved following them, the one who also had leaned back against him during the supper and had said, Lord, who is that? Who is it that is going to betray you? Well, we know that's John. Verse 21, when Peter saw him, he said to Jesus, Lord, what about this man? Jesus said to him, if it is my will that he remain until I come, what is that to you? You follow me. You follow me. Verse 23, so the saying spread abroad among the brothers that his disciple was not to die. Yet Jesus did not say to him that he was not to die, but if it is my will that he remain until I come, what is that to you? So Jesus is is talking to Peter, and Peter's like pointing to John, well, what about him? And Jesus says, if I wanted him to remain until I come, then he'll remain until I come. But he's saying that's not of your concern. He's saying to Peter, you follow me. You follow me. Don't worry about John's life. Don't worry about that. And they took that in verse 23 and said, oh, wow, that he's not going to die. John's not going to die. And that's not what Jesus was saying. And really, how much does that relate to us? Because Jesus really says that to Peter, but he says it right straight through Peter, right to us. We get so concerned about other people, and he's saying, they're not of your concern. You follow me. You follow me. Well, what's happening with the church right now during this crisis? You follow me. I mean, are people having launching new relationships with Jesus? Maybe, yes. But what about you? What about you? And even where Peter was trying to point, like, what about that? What about this? What about squirrel? What about that? Jesus is saying, what about you? What about you? You follow me. And Peter asks a question to Jesus regarding the disciple Jesus loved, and we know who that is. It's John. But he says, Peter, it's not your concern. You follow me. Let's pick up verse 24. This is the disciple who is bearing witness about these things, and who has written these things, and we know that his testimony is true. Verse 25. Now there are also many other things that Jesus did, where every one of them let me start over. Now there are also many other things that Jesus did, were every one of them to be written. I suppose that the world itself could not contain the books that would be written. So we know that Jesus did many more miracles, and we only know of a few. And if everything that he did was written down, John's saying that we wouldn't be able to hold, these books wouldn't be able to be written. So somebody tallied up the every incident in the Gospels, and it really comes to about 3 months. So we are only experiencing 3 months of the 3 years that happened. And what happened in those 3 months? The storm on the sea, the feeding of the 5,000, the Sermon on the Mount, the healing of the lame. All these things. But really, if you tally them all up, if you go real time, it would be about 3 months. And John is making a point here, and he's saying that this is not everything that Jesus did. These are highlights. And so, which is interesting, because verse 25 sounds like a second ending. Because chapter 20 ended with a real powerful ending. So now 21 is like a second ending, very similar to the first ending. And where John, the disciple, states, let me remind you, in chapter 20, verse 30 and 31, the previous chapter, it says Jesus performed many other signs, and this is what it said in the last chapter. Jesus performed many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book, but these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. That was the last chapter. And then he concludes with this verse of the 21st chapter. Now there are also many other things that Jesus did, were every one of them to be written. I suppose that the world itself could not contain the books that would be written. And with that, John concludes his gospel. And with that, concludes our exploration of the book of John. And if you remember, let me take you back. We began this adventure with the focus on learning the heart of the Father. If you started with us, you'll remember that was the thrust of the purpose of what we started out, to know the heart of the Father. And it started out with God really pointing out to me one day when somebody asked me an incident that happened, and I heard an incident happen. I don't know if it was a hurricane in Florida or whatever world disaster had happened, and I had heard where somebody asked the question, was that God? And did God do that? And I immediately knew it wasn't. And then I thought, how do I know it wasn't? How do I know that God didn't bring that? And it was because I knew the heart of the Father. And I thought, wow, what if we all know the heart of the Father? I mean, aren't we all too? I don't think it's reserved for the pastors only. And I thought, okay, so how do I know the heart of the Father? And one of the ways is watching Jesus. Because Jesus came to reveal the heart of the Father. We knew God as a judge in the Old Testament, as a lawgiver. We knew him as a creator, but we didn't know his heart as a father. And it wasn't until the Son comes that the heart of the Father was revealed. And then Jesus says these words in John. He says, if you see me, you've seen the Father. We're one. In other words, he was saying, I'm here to reveal to you God. You, for the first time, can see the actions of God. Because what you see me do is what the heart of the Father is. Because he said, I do nothing outside of what the Father tells me to do. So we have journeyed through John, witnessing the heart of the Father through the actions of Jesus. And so we learned that. And that was our exploration. Now, on the way, we saw the focus of John, who wrote the gospel. And John emphasized as he was the Son of God. And he says that in his last verse. But not only the Son of God, but he was God. He is God. And we learn that from John 1:1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Wow. So we learn that in the beginning, and then he brings it at the end here. And he says that, and he ends the first ending at the end of chapter 20, and then the second ending in chapter 21. So now what? Now what? I mean, we just finished John. We're done with John. Now what? Let me tell you, one of the core elements of discipleship is to know God. And our mission is to make disciples. One of the core values and the core elements of disciples is to know who you're following, to know Jesus. Who is it that we're following? So John showed us, as I said, that he's the Son of God. So now what? I want to read you that closing verse one more time in John chapter 20, verse 30. Jesus performed many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book. But these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah and the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in his name. And we just saw him breathe new life. So when I stopped, I didn't even have to think. I really knew the next step. Because now it's time to explore Jesus, the Messiah. And so we're going to jump right into it. Jesus is the Son of God, but Jesus is also the Messiah, the one who's come to save him. So we're going to not even skip a step. We're going to start next Thursday, the book of Matthew, because Matthew's message is that Jesus is the Messiah. And we're going to look at it from a Jewish historical, cultural view. And we're not going to go through every piece of Matthew, but we're going to pull out some historical and cultural things very similar to what we did in John. And we're going to uncover some of these things that we normally just read by. And so you're gonna know things about Matthew that most believers don't even spend time looking at. And what it does, it's not just going to build your knowledge, but when we uncover these things, what it does is it adds to the knowing of him and who Jesus is. So we're going to continue to explore who Jesus is, because I don't think we can ever exhaust that. But I love how John emphasizes not only the Son of God, which is his emphasis, but the Messiah. And that was Matthew's emphasis, was the Messiah. So we're going to get into more Jewish culture than even John, because the Messiah is a Hebrew word. And so we're going to look, and it's very exciting. I'm really excited to do this. And so next Thursday, we begin a new journey through the book of Matthew. So it's another perspective of who Jesus is. John looked at Jesus this way. Matthew is going to look at him as the Messiah. And we're going to see some similar, but some very different approaches to that. So I look forward to next Thursday. I'll see you Sunday. We had a wonderful Easter. Well, I can say I had a wonderful Easter time, and I hope you did as well as you looked at the recording. And so I want you to remember, and don't forget, information plus information equals more information. But information plus application equals transformation. So with that, I say good night. Have a great night. And let me just pray for you before you go. Father, I pray in Jesus' name that you would seal the things that we have learned. Lord, there are things that were uncovered, Lord, that give us a more rich picture of who you are. Because we believe you and we choose to follow you. But as we learn more of who you are, it just gets better and better, or gooder and gooder. And we want more of you. And so right now, Lord, as we journey into Matthew, as we journey into another perspective of who you are, may it add and enrich this moment right now, this moment and this time, and what we're going through. And may it add to our knowledge and our experience of you. And so I just pray that, and I seal these